I'm so honored to introduce our keynote guests. First, Rebecca Jarvis is an Emmy Award winning journalist. She is an ABC News chief business, technology, and economics correspondent, and the host and creator of the highly acclaimed podcast, No Limits with Rebecca Jarvis. And I can tell you it's featured many of the most dynamic women in media, in entertainment, and business. It's terrific. Rebecca, we're a little jealous here because a lot of people on your list are people we'd love to have with us. We're also incredibly excited to welcome one of our board members and a dear friend of the center. Rita Ferro is the president of ad sales at Disney. Last year, the center was so happy to award Rita with the Frank Stanton Award for Excellence in Media, a much deserved honor. We're so glad that Rita and Disney share our values here at the center. And I have no doubt whatsoever that this will be an inspirational conversation. Please take it away, Rita.
Thank you, Max. And thank you for including Rebecca and I today. These are some of the most, fun events for us to get to do because they're so inspiring, and to just see the potential that sits among this group of talented students is so exciting for both of us, and also to get to spend time talking together, because Rebecca and I, outside of being great coworkers, we are great friends, and I have so much respect and admiration for her. And as I was watching the opening video, Rebecca, and listening to Julie from McKinsey talk about the challenges of women, it reminded me of the segment I saw and I commented on this week when you posted on Instagram a story that you did on the unfair impact that this COVID crisis is having on women. And just the story, it was so powerful to watch that story and just tell the story. And I realized you are an incredible storyteller because of the passion you have around the stories that you cover. So can you talk to the team a little bit? Because I know your story, but I would love for everybody to hear how you actually got into this business. And was it your plan A? Because I also saw in the video, which I loved, I actually wrote it down, people that had a plan B never did their plan A. And I'm like, I never had a plan B. I'm not sure I had a plan A, but I didn't have a plan B, so I had to get going. But was this your plan A, and how did you get started?
So thank you so much, Rita. I'm thrilled to be here today and talking about what I consider to be a really important topic. And it's funny. I grew up in a family of journalists. My mom is a journalist. My grandfather was a journalist. And it was always something that I admired. But to be entirely frank, I went to college and took on a lot of student loan debt. And in my conversations with my mom and my grandfather and various family members along the way, there was this realization at the time that if I were to go straight to journalism, which was a passion of mine, that student loan debt would probably follow me for the rest of my life. I also had a passion for business and economics. That's what I studied in college, and constitutional law. Even there was a time in college where I thought maybe I wanted to become a lawyer. Maybe I would go to law school at some point. But I ultimately made this decision coming out of college, pretty deep in debt, and knowing that I was the one who was going to be paying off that burden. I made a decision to go into finance initially. And I have to say, it was the act of doing what I was doing. I was in investment banking. It was not always pleasant. In fact, I pretty much hated my job from the very first day. And I didn't hate the people. I ended up meeting my husband on that first job. We sat back to back in a cubicle, and that's a whole other story. By the way, I told him I liked him when he told me he was quitting, because my mom told me never to date anybody that I worked with. And I followed that advice. But ultimately, I told him I liked him. So a lot of good things came out of it. A great husband came out of it, and an incredible daughter now as a result of that husband. But I think for me, this path was always something I wanted, but I didn't think that there was coming out of college, that there was an instant plan that was going to work for me financially, and I couldn't see the path. So going into finance, which was something that interested me, gave me a foundation, and it also gave me what I describe as a side door into this profession as a journalist, because it gave me an expertise. And so when I did start pursuing journalism jobs, which was about a year and a half into my time in investment banking, I was able to go to those employers with ideas for stories based on the work that I was doing and the world that I was seeing. And when I look back on that, it wasn't necessarily by design, but it ultimately worked out that, Rita, I was able to get into environments that I may not, it might have taken me many, many more years if I had just gone purely from a journalism path, that somehow I gave myself some credibility on an area that not everybody in the newsroom had that expertise. And that allowed me to, I ultimately got my first journalism jobs by taking out business editors. I would ask them out for coffee in Chicago. I was in Chicago at the time, and pitching them stories. And Crane Chicago Business was one of the places that took a nibble, and I started writing for them. And I really do believe that the path, I have no idea what would have happened on the path, but I do believe that that sort of interesting background that not every other journalist in the newsroom had is the thing that landed me that first job, and also carried me into jobs like CNBC and ultimately to ABC News.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting that you say that, because when I think of also, if you think of someone else on our air today, Dr. Jen Ashton, who's a doctor, and yet she's probably one of the main voices on television today that people tune in and listen to. And it was that original experience as a doctor that gives her the credibility to actually be able to report and have authenticity and expertise to be able to actually tell a point of view and be thoughtful about how she says it, understanding that obviously she has influence now in a different way because she is a doctor.
Right. And I think, I mean, I love Dr. Jen. She is brilliant and she's so good at her job. And she's also an incredible doctor. And I think when people ask me for advice, they often ask me, should I go to journalism school? What should I study? What's the path? The reality is my mom went to journalism school and my grandfather went to journalism school. I didn't do that. So either way, it can work out, is my point there. But I also believe that if there's another interest of yours, whether it's politics or medicine or finance or fine arts, if you are the person in a newsroom who has that specific expertise and the story of the day becomes based on that, you put your hand up as high as you can. You let everybody in the newsroom know, I'm the one here. Come to me anytime. If you know a foreign language and suddenly a story is unfolding in a foreign country and it has a significant headline for the United States, go to your bosses, let them know that thing that you also bring to the table in addition to being a storyteller and a trained journalist.
Yeah, I agree. I love that story. I love the story of it's not always the most visible path. That's how you got there. And also the story, frankly, because I think it's a real story for everyone who's watching this. And I had the same thing. I was lucky. My parents paid for my undergraduate degree, but I paid for my master's degree, and I also had debt. And I was lucky to work for a company that actually helped me pay for some of that because of the company that we work for. But this notion of going into an area that you knew was important and that you had a passion for, but never losing sight of what you really wanted to do, right? Because ultimately there's no linear way to get to any role that you do.
Never.
Really everyone has a different role. And, people often ask me when I started in this company, I started working at ESPN. So not even, and international. So I wasn't even in the US side of the business. I never thought, and people often ask me, did you ever think you would be in the role that you're in? Never, right? Like first of all, it's not even conceivable when you're that young to think of, like these were roles that were like people who were like institutions in the business that had been here for years. And when I think about the path I took, which was starting at ESPN, then moving to Latin America, and then 10 years ago, when I was asked to come to the US and run the kids and family portfolio business. And I remember telling one of the bosses, there's 4 bosses. And I remember asking one of them, like, why do you want me? Like, I don't know anybody in the US. And he's like, well, that's not why we're hiring you. Right. And so you never actually, and yet at the same time, I raised my hand because it was interesting and it was challenging. And it gave me a little bit of fear. And I always say, when you feel that in your gut, that those butterflies, it's probably something you should try, right? Because only when you have a little bit of that insecurity and excitement and, you know, passion for something, but not really sure, I think you work that much harder at it and you're that much more successful at it, right? Because it means you're taking it seriously enough and that you're going to go for it. And I remember having this conversation with him and just, you know, every role after that has been the same way, right? When they tapped me to run ABC, you know, there was 3 other women who were infinitely more on paper qualified to do the job. I ran the smallest group of the 4 of us. And yet, you know, I was told to do that. And then I took, ultimately, my boss at ESPN retired. I took on ESPN and now Hulu and the stations and all of that. And every single time it's been an interesting, you feel that like nervousness in your stomach, that never goes away. And I always say to people, whenever you have the chance to do something that gives you that little nervousness and it doesn't go away, that's the right thing to do, right? You never want to be in a role where you feel like, oh, this is it. Because there's just so much to do and there's so much opportunity. That's the other great thing about everyone who's watching this today is like, because there's not a linear path to get to where we are, because there's so many ways that you can basically get to do what you want to do. And technology is enabling that, and the speed of which everything changes. You know, I think about it some days, I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep up, right? With the change that keeps happening. And yet these guys grew up in that environment. I look at my daughter and it's like, she, you know, she's used to working on 18 devices with, you know, a third of her attention on different things and being super successful at it. And you're also super comfortable being out there and being, you know, speaking up. And I was like a very shy, introverted, right? It was not natural. So the opportunities and how, you know, people have come into, you know, their career growth and their career path and how they've gotten there is much more decisive, I think, than you and I, who we had a passion and an idea, but it was probably not super well thought out, nor were we as passionate. You know, you knew you had to pay your bills. I knew I had to figure out how I was going to get in there and, you know, figure out how to resource myself to be able to do that too. And by the way, I don't think that's changed now. I actually think these, you know, kids coming through college now feel the same sense of burden. And when I talk to many of them, they also feel the burden of, you know, I'm going to college and I also have to help my family.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that you can't ultimately reach the career that you want to have if you're passionate about it and, you know, dedicated to it. And by the way, also, I agree with you, raising your hand and always being the most prepared. I will never, I use this all the time with my teams, which is I remember my dad used to say to me, you know, as a woman and as a Latin woman, right, you're probably not going to always have a seat at the table. So when you get a seat at the table, you have to be the best prepared, the most knowledgeable, and contribute. And so I've never forgotten that, right? Every time I go into a meeting, I always prep for my meeting. I'm always prepared with some nugget of something. And by the way, it could be relevant or not based on how the meeting goes, but because you're well prepared and because you've, you know, read enough about it or whatever, you will be able to contribute. And who doesn't want someone to come back and contribute, right? When I think about every time I invite someone to a meeting and they contributed, whether it was ultimately the right path or not, the fact that they were engaged is exciting, and you want those people in the room. So I never forget those things, because I think it's, you know, just like your mom and your grandfather said to you, like, hey, journalism is great, but you got to pay the bills. And right, like, yeah, but you want to be there, right? And tell the stories, and you've done a great job of telling stories. So can I ask you another question? When you think about the stories that you want to tell, to highlight, obviously you and I have a lot of conversations around, you know, what's going on in the economy and how will this have a long-term impact? And obviously the story you told the other day, similar to what Julie from McKinsey said, is this is not about now, this has a long-term impact and will impact women in business overall. How do you figure out what are the right stories to tell in the context of that versus the business reporting that you do?
So I want to answer that question, but I also want to say something I was thinking about as you were talking, because Rita, the first time I interviewed you, I remember an intern came up to me after the interview and she asked me this question. She basically said, how do people like Rita know all the opportunities to take along the way that amount to like the really big jobs? And I told her, basically, that in my experience and in all of the interviews, it's really only looking backwards that everything sort of fits into place and makes full sense. When you're looking forwards, you're kind of doing it as much as on instinct as you are on what sounds like the most interesting thing at the time, what seems like the best opportunity. So for anybody who is listening right now, who looks at the resumes and feels overwhelmed by the story as they look backwards in time, remember that everybody who's lived that story lived it looking forwards in time. And when you're looking forwards, nothing is completely clear cut, but it is what you make of it. And Rita made incredible things of every single experience along the way and made decisions to keep moving forward. When it comes to stories for me, as you were asking the question, I sort of had this flashback to the many years that I've now had this career as a journalist. And I think what's interesting is that when I started my career as a journalist, my biggest concern was finding the stories that my bosses would like. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially when you're starting your career, in my opinion, to find the things that, if you're working inside of a company, to find the things that your company values. And obviously, if you align with those values and if that's what you care about, that's a really good situation to be in. I think as my career has progressed over time and I found multiple ways to deliver to what the interests were of my bosses, I mean, and also of the audience, you always have to think as a journalist of the audience, who is consuming this product, and think about, is it relevant to them? But as time has gone forward, I also try and push to think beyond that a little bit. I oftentimes, I did this project in 5th grade on Picasso, and for whatever reason, it really stood out to me, okay? So bear with me. So Picasso, in the beginning, he painted everything true to life. He went through a rose period and a blue period, and you could look at a painting and you would know, that's a woman, that's a family. But what he's really known for is his cubism, where he completely mixed the whole thing up, followed completely new rules. And I oftentimes think of careers and the kind of career that I have had, that I want to have, as sort of following a path in that way, which is you learn in the beginning how to deliver. You learn in the beginning the basic foundation of doing it right, in quotation marks. And if you're lucky, and I feel that I've been incredibly lucky in my career and worked very hard for that, you start to get to interpret and create with your own vision in mind. And so now, as I think about stories, I spend a lot of time thinking about our audience. That is part of, I get so many emails, especially now, from women, from small business owners who are women, from women who have had to step away from the workforce because their moms and their children don't have childcare and don't have schools to go to right now. And when I hear over and over again from people who are facing the same challenges about that experience, it's a sign, it's a signal to me that that's something we need to be exposing and talking about. But I also, there's the stories maybe that aren't so obvious. I mean, I guess I would say one for me was covering Elizabeth Holmes and the story of Theranos, which was, for those who don't know, at a time she was the youngest self-made female billionaire. She created this company, Theranos, that was supposed to change the world with blood testing technology. And on that story, no one contacted me and said, you should do this story, and this is something that's important. I just became fascinated by her story and by certain things that didn't connect, aspects of her story and what was in the press that wasn't, when I looked more deeply into it, wasn't connecting. And I became personally so attracted to the story and so obsessed with understanding it and getting inside of it and I'm glad, honestly, that it came in the point in my life where I had the guts, I guess, to pursue it without anyone externally validating it for me. And I think that's another piece, that if you are a journalist, if this is your path, you have to listen to those things that you just if you can't let go of it, if you're thinking about it at night before you go to sleep, if you're posing questions that haven't been answered, and every day you're thinking about those things, it is worth pursuing. And I would say it's worth pursuing even if those around you are not immediately as engaged or enthralled by the story as you feel.
That's true. You know, it's funny because Juju said in that opening video, I don't know if you caught,
Yeah.
I used to do stories for my boss, and you just said the same thing. And it's funny because I think as you start your career, you obviously, your bosses become your mentors, your facilitators, your allies, and could really work to help accelerate your career or to really guide you and that. And you know, one of the things I always say is, you know, pick the boss more than the job, because if you work for the right person, you're going to be inspired, you're going to be challenged, you're going to be rewarded, and you're going to have someone who's invested in your success. And I have always found that when I took a job, because there was someone who I reported to that was super interesting, it always made a difference. And it, by the way, it made a difference for me even when I had a job with a boss who was not necessarily of my choice. You know, as you know, we had a reorg here a couple of years ago, and I was put under a guy who used to be M&A for the company, right? He had not had operational experience. And yet I feel like I learned so much from him as a sales deal maker, right? Because I run a sales organization, and never had I had a boss who was a deal maker. They came up through management, through whatever way they came up. And they hadn't really been someone who understood the art of the deal, the psychology of a deal, how you sit, how, you know, both sides have to leave the table feeling like they won, or it's not really going to be long-term. And I got a ton of that from that boss. And so to me, that's always been such an important motivator in terms of picking the people you get to work for. And so I asked you this question because I think it's an interesting one, which is, obviously you started in finance and then you went into, CNBC and Cranes, but you're ultimately here at ABC. Why ABC, and why did you come here? Was there something about the way we do things here, or is there something more about the person you're working for that really inspired you? Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's a great question. The people are what originally drew me to ABC News. And I think back to the first meetings that I had with ABC, and there's a Pan Quotidian that's around the corner from where ABC is, which you would never go to now. But at the time it was the place, and there was like this tiny little table that was around the corner that the bosses would secretly meet with people at, so that no one would see them having these meetings. And I just felt instantly like these are people who love storytelling, who want to pursue the truth, who also are invested in their employees, who care about their employees, and who would be interested and appear to be interested in me. I think the breadth of ABC News being under the ABC umbrella and then the Disney umbrella, and having so many different outlets. When I came to ABC, it felt so much bigger than anywhere else in the news business that I had worked. And that was, to be honest, it was overwhelming initially, but now that I have been here now for almost 8 years, it's an incredible asset. And I say that at a time where I recognize that a lot of smaller companies, and this is not a knock in any way on smaller companies, I get it, they're appealing, you can be scrappy inside of them, you can do a lot more, you can have your hands, especially in the early days, on a lot of things. But I also would say not to overlook the value of being inside of an organization that has lots of different tentacles, because those tentacles can become opportunity. And while they might not be the initial opportunity, especially, you know, when you get inside of a company, or at least in my experience, you get inside of a company, again, you deliver, you do exactly what you need to do in the early days. But as that expands, and you get to know people inside of that larger organization, opportunities can really come of that. And I mean, I love Rita, for example. Our friendship has really grown completely organically. And because this is a company with so many different opportunities, it's not just the opportunities in and of themselves, it's also the people. Back to our relationship, there's so many great relationships that I feel so lucky to have. And I do really think it's because of the job and the company.
Yeah, I couldn't be more in agreement, right? It's the same thing as like, you know, you pick your bosses versus the job. Great jobs are what you make of them, sometimes more than they could actually be written on a piece of paper. And part of that is just who you work for and who you work with. So before we get to Q&A, I want to ask you, and I will do the same. If you had yourself today coming out of college the way, you know, our audience is, what do you think you've learned that you wish you knew then that would be super helpful for these guys to know as they think about, how do I get in? How do I break in? Especially now that we're all at home. Mm-hmm. And it's harder to make that first impression in person when you're not doing it. Sometimes it's, you know, on these screens, it's a little more, you know, antiseptic, if you will. But at the same time, how do you, or if you're sending in a letter or a resume, how do you break in, or what do you do differently based on your experience that you think of now if you were coming out of college?
I really want to hear what your answer to this is, Rita, as well. I would say that the thing that no matter what time we're in, whether we were in a pandemic or not, one of the biggest lessons I believe for my life looking backwards is not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, to worry a lot less. I think, you know, I think back about networking and the early days of networking for me, and I was so worried in networking situations about putting my best foot forward that I didn't really enjoy myself enough. And I probably, look, I don't regret anything. I genuinely don't. But if I had gone into those situations with the feeling that I'm fine. I'm Rebecca Jarvis. And you know what? If I hope that people like who Rebecca Jarvis is, but really looking for a connection with people and meeting them on the human level, as opposed to trying to wear my resume on my chest and make sure that they really get to know who Rebecca Jarvis is, so she makes an impression and she gets the job. I think I would have enjoyed it a little bit more. And so to enjoy it more, I think is a valuable lesson as I look backwards and as I look forwards, frankly, that to remember that you're living right now. So if you're really unhappy or dissatisfied, there's no guarantee that you're going to get the next thing. So if the thing that you're doing right now is not satisfying to you, either you have to make a change to the thing itself, or you have to find a way to do that thing differently within it. I also think that right now, the beauty of this moment is that you can actually, in my opinion, connect with people more in some ways than you could prior. And what I mean by that is, maybe it's the pandemic, maybe it's the situation we're all living in, so many of us still working from home. There's just, whether it's social media, I have been reached out to by so many young people on Instagram and on Twitter, and I've done conversations like this with them just because they happened to reach out to me in that capacity, and formed friendships with them as a result. So I would not be fearful of going out and doing that, and seeking those connections, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is. I wouldn't be fearful, and I would not take it personally or even think twice if someone doesn't write you back, or if they write you back. No, it's just a game of numbers. Keep going. There's going to be people out there that you connect with, and there will be others that you don't. But if you keep trying to make those connections, I guarantee you will form some of them. Okay, Rita, what's your advice?
It's so funny, you were talking, I was getting a scratchy throat. I totally agree. I have done exactly the same thing you have. So I have, I participated the other day. I'm on the the National Hispanic Scholarship Fund had a program similar to this one. And like 5 of those kids reached out to me afterwards. And as I said at the beginning of this, I'm fascinated by the energy and the creativity and just the passion of kids coming out today, because there's so much energy. And again, I talked a lot about it at the beginning, which is there's so much change happening in our business. Mm-hmm. The people with the greatest pulse on what is going on are you guys. And I think you have to really understand the value that you bring into an organization as a young, well-prepared, energetic, potential talent to come into an organization, and the contribution you can make very quickly by doing that. And I totally agree. I think that the notion of reaching out to people and the social aspect of participating in these these series and opportunities, and then reaching out to the speakers. Again, if everybody doesn't reach out back out to you, okay, but I can tell you 9 out of 10 times, if I'm not reaching out to them, I'll ask someone on my team to go back and reach out to them, right? Because we are all looking for talent. And by the way, women and people of color are the talent I am most looking for right now, because we are all focused on diversifying our employee pool. And so to the extent that I want great, prepared, excited talent to come into our organization, we are spending a lot of time, myself, my teams, and our recruiting teams, really meeting with a lot of people to make sure that we have enough bench in the pipeline to be able to start to bring people in and bring them up. So for sure, I totally agree of reaching out to people, because you're absolutely right. I've done the same thing and you've done the same thing. And that would have never happened, by the way, if I was in the office. You just wouldn't
likewise.
You wouldn't have time. The other piece, I think, is it's also about, you don't realize who you know and who they know. And the whole notion of the tools that you have at your disposal today with LinkedIn and Twitter and everything else, on figuring out how do you get someone to give you a reference or to get in, because, I'm a big believer in, and this is no knock on Harvard and Stanford by any means. I was not smart enough to get into any of them, so no knock on them. But I don't necessarily believe that always the Harvard and Stanford people are the most qualified people. Mm-hmm. Right? Sometimes, people who came in through the state school system because that's what they could afford, or by the way, that's what they had access to, are the people who are more scrappy and get in there. And so I don't ever want anyone to feel like, I didn't go to an Ivy, so therefore I do not qualify to get into company A, B, or C. Because there's many, many other ways to access, through school associations and through just internships. I mean, I used to raise my hand and do any project. It didn't matter what it was, just to learn if I liked or I didn't like something. And so the notion of just being, flexible and open to that. But I also think, always, raise your hand, because there's just so much opportunity out there. And I do think, again, as diverse backgrounds and women coming into this business, you heard the stats from Julie from McKinsey before, right? We have a ways to go, and COVID has taken us back, but we have a ways to go. And there's never been a bigger focus on this from people of color and women in our business, to really make sure that we are opening doors for the next generation, just as people did it for us, right? Like, because we didn't get to where we got to just on our own merits. We also had allies and people who took an interest in helping elevate us in these programs. So it looks like we have the first question ready to go. So I will hand it off to whoever is going to be asking the questions.
Hi, I'm the first question. My name is Hannah Groman, and I go to Drake University, which is in Des Moines, Iowa. But right now I am home in Chicago for the winter. And my question to you guys revolves around the fact that women in leadership are pretty frequently vilified or described as bossy or pushy, where our male counterparts would be like driven or ambitious. As we've seen recently with Senator Ocasio-Cortez being referred to with some very harsh language by a fellow representative in public. Have you guys experienced this like vilification, like this phenomenon? And how do you think it ties into the greater narrative surrounding women in leadership?
I can tell you I have experienced it, not necessarily towards me that I'm aware of. By the way, it might be said every single day, who knows? I will tell you, one of the most important things I have in my core group is I have a group of women who I call my tribe. They're the people who are, call it 5 or 6 women in this company that I reach out to. They're the ones who keep me honest, who challenge me, who I come back to and they're like, they call me out on my, you know, things that they should call me out on. They encourage me. And by the way, they celebrate me when I get promoted, not because I got promoted, but because one of us was able to break through and do the next thing. And we do it for each other all the time. And so, you know, is there a double standard? Yes, I'm not going to lie and say there's not a double standard. I feel like that still exists today. And I agree with you. You know, for men, it's passionate. For women, it's, you know, whatever the adjective is. Ultimately, you know, as I say to many people, being Latin and being direct and being ambitious is my secret sauce. And so, you know, I'm comfortable with it. And as long as you're comfortable with it, you know, the reality is people will always have their points of view. That's just a reality of the business. But I think the more and more you're going to see women breaking through, and they continue to do so across businesses. I mean, you're seeing now many more boards with women on them. You're seeing many more women in the C-suite. That will continue to be something that eventually will go away. But I tend to not focus on that, and I tend to focus on the opportunity.
Rita, how many people are on your team? How many people do you manage?
1,800.
1,800. So that, I mean, from my experience, I come from a very different world. I do not manage 1,800 people. So I applaud Rita and everything that she's doing. I would say in my experience, Hannah, it's less about the vilification that I've faced and more about cultures. And it's so interesting, you know, being in finance early on in my career and being one of the only women, you might think that that's where the culture would have been the most abrasive. But I found it, interestingly enough, in journalism. And for me, and I'll say this today very candidly, because I hope that none of you ever face this, but for me, it was a big challenge in my career. You know, you might try and fight it. I did. I tried to change it. And for many, many years, I would sort of every day think about how I was going to climb out of a box that I felt like I was stuck inside of. And eventually I got to a point where there were just better opportunities in other places. And so for me, rather than trying to fight something that felt like a losing battle, I made a decision to move on. And in some ways, that was a really tough call. You know, I wanted to fight it because I wanted to help others, other women. And I also wanted things to work. I didn't want to, on some level, admit to myself that I couldn't figure out a way around a culture that was never going to work for me. But making the decision to walk away, and now being in a place like ABC News, which I believe fully validates and appreciates the work that I do every day, there's nothing better. And so I will just say that for me, that right decision, after really trying to change and challenge what I thought was a problem, the better move for me personally was to walk away and be in a place that really appreciates me.
Thank you guys both so much for being so open. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emily. I'm from Hofstra University. I graduated last year. It's an honor to speak with both of you. My question is about when there's a lot of different opportunities, sometimes I feel overwhelmed of what's the right decision. And so how do you filter figuring out the right choices when it comes to opportunity? Because sometimes I feel just overwhelmed with all the different options out there of what direction to take.
You know, I'll start, Rebecca, if you don't mind.
Sure.
What I have found, and you know, I have a 15-year-old daughter, and we're talking a lot about colleges now and where she wants to go to school and what she wants to study. And of course, I am always like engineering or medicine. Just right. Don't you want to be a cardiologist? She's like, right, no, and no, because they're not her passion. And so at the end of the day, I always loved TV and I always loved movies. So, and by the way, I think I never thought I wanted to be what I do today, but I knew that I had that passion for, I love going to the movies. Like one of the hardest things for me in COVID is that I cannot go to a movie theater and watch movies. And so ultimately, I think really focusing on what makes you happy, because the amount of hours that you spend doing what you do, and you will spend doing what you do, by the way, is unbelievable. Like when I tell you, I easily spend, I don't know, 14 hours to 16 hours a day working Monday through Friday. I'm not exaggerating. And the higher up you go, the more hours you're going to spend, just because you're just on call more and things happen. So make sure that it is something that you love to do. When I went to get my MBA, I had a moment where I was like, I'm going to get my MBA because I just don't know if I want to stay doing what I'm doing in this company. And it was not about the MBA, but it was about meeting people from the banking industry and computers and all of these different industries, and seeing how much better my job and the company I worked for was, to really re-engage me and re-energize me, and understanding that I was right where I was supposed to be, and that I should really double down on this company and what I wanted to do here. Because by the way, when I talked to all of these other people, they had nowhere near as much fun in their job as I had, nor did they actually really love what they did it because they needed to have a good paying job that paid the bills, not because they would do it even if they didn't make money at it. If I didn't make money doing what I was doing, I would still love what I do. That to me is a litmus test for where I should be spending my time and energy, which is why, by the way, I spend a lot of time now on organizations that I have a true passion around, right? In terms of on boards and investing time and volunteering and whatever, because I would do them because even if I don't get paid, because I believe in that. That's where you realize you found the right place.
I completely agree with everything Rita said. And the only other thing I would add to that is, it's not the wrong decision if you remind yourself that you can change decisions at any time. I think what's really important is that you listen to yourself after you've made a choice. You listen to yourself. If it's not the right choice, you just go about building out and figuring out your plan to get to another alternative. And I would say to anyone here who's watching, who, you made a choice about which college to go to. You might have thought before you made that decision that it was the biggest decision of your life. I remember it was a very, very stressful time in our house to figure out the college. And there were moments where it was like, well, if it's not this school, then what? What are we going to do? And I think probably what I realized, and what many of you may have realized as well, is that there isn't just one choice that works. There are many choices that can work. And again, back to that same idea of, if it's not working, then make a change. It doesn't have to be what you decide it is on point A. There are many, many stops along a career journey, and you can always pivot. And so many people do. And are very successful doing that.
My question was for Rebecca. Well, I'm sorry. So my name is Anisha. I attend DePaul University, and I'm getting my graduate degree in digital communication and media arts. But I'm currently in Pennsylvania due to the stay-at-home order in Chicago. So my question is for Rebecca, and it was about how you started pitching stories when you were early on. So did you ever get intimidated? What was the process of pitching stories originally? You talked about how you were meeting with all these editors. Were there stories that the editors passed on that you really liked? Kind of what was the process of first getting into journalism and pitching stories?
Great question, Anisha. Thank you. So I was in Chicago. I was in investment banking at the time. I put together a list of, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 story ideas, but they were all based on trends and experiences that I was seeing. And I cold called all of the business editors in Chicago. So I literally just went through newspapers and looked, who's the business editor? Okay, I'm calling that person. And back to sort of this idea that you can't focus on the ones who don't return your call. Like, focusing on that is pointless. You have no idea why they're not returning your call. It could be that they're not interested in you. It might also just be that they're busy. It might be that they never even got the message. So I focused on the people who did return my calls. And and it was hard. I mean, going to a coffee with a business editor who worked with the top business reporters in the city of Chicago, considering that I was not a journalist at all, I was coming from a completely different world. That was an overwhelming experience, but I would go into each coffee with the intention of having a conversation. I didn't start the conversation, by the way, with, I have these 3 ideas, can I write one for you? Instead, they were all introductory conversations. Tell me more about yourself. How did you get this job? I'm really interested in making a transition in my career, and I would really like to understand what your career trajectory has been, what you look for in a business journalist. And at the end of the conversation, as things were wrapping up, I would say, would you be okay? I have 3 or 4 ideas. I'd love to share them with you and get your opinion about them. If there was ever an opportunity for me to write any of these for you, I would love to write them for you. And my mom, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a journalist, did give me one great piece of advice for that, which was, you can have your ideas at these meetings. If they tell you that you can't write for them, that they don't need any of them, or they can't help you, offer to write one for free. But don't offer to write it for free before they've already turned it down. Just wait and see what they say. And for me, what was very fortuitous and lucky is that Crain's Chicago Business had been looking at one of the areas, I didn't know it at the time, but they were looking at how to cover one of the story ideas that I brought to them. I was given my experience in investment banking, I had seen that all these companies, this was 2005, were taking on more and more debt, and that the restrictions that were being placed on that debt were getting lesser and lesser. And I pitched them that story, and it was exactly what they needed and wanted at the time. And they had already been having, little did I know, but they had already been having conversations about how to cover that area. And so it just happened to be a great fit. So I think it's really a matter of getting yourself out there, mind over matter. Again, it doesn't have to be the perfect conversation, but I do believe if you can walk into that conversation with some ideas that are based on your own experience. Rita said it earlier. She likes people when they speak up in meetings, even if they're not right, or even if they don't have the exact idea that the team pursues. When you show up as someone who's going to solve problems, who's going to bring ideas to the table and do the heavy lifting initially, even before you're asked to do it, that's the kind of person most people want in their organizations. So worry less about being perfect and right, and more just about doing some of the thinking ahead of time and offering something.
Hi, my name is Kasha. I'm a senior at New York University, and I'm majoring in media and communications and a minor in psychology. I wanted to ask you both if there's any suggestions or piece of advice you may have for us students who are entering the workforce soon and starting the application process for jobs. I know it's a really difficult time. I interned this past summer online virtually, and it was definitely a little bit difficult networking through Zoom, but I'm looking forward to applying. So I just wanted to ask you both if there's any piece of advice you may have for us.
Well, Kasha, I would say, at Disney, we do a lot of hiring out of our internship program. And a lot of our internship programs are really either rising seniors or seniors who just graduated in that summer timeframe as they start heading into the fall, because summer tends to be, from a media perspective, kind of like I'm not going to say a dead time, but it's more of a, the shows are in production, and on the business side, we finish certain upfronts or whatever. And then there's like a slow, so the internship program gets a lot of attention because from a business perspective, we're not super busy in terms of attention being drawn somewhere else. And I can tell you from our internship program, which by the way is a paid internship program, we tend to hire a lot of candidates from there. And we're working a lot on, from a company perspective, making sure this year in particular, we're spending a lot of time on hiring a lot of candidates from diverse backgrounds. and women, because it's, again, a focus and a priority for our company, all the way up to the CEO level, by the way. And really having a broad-based internship program, meaning if before you used to be like an intern at ABC News or an internship in sales or in marketing. And now this is more of a rotational internship to give you a flavor and experience, frankly, broadly in the business side, so that our interns are also picking to choose what areas they really want to go into, since the need is so vast and so big. And for us to really get a sense of where are the biggest skill sets and biggest opportunities to place talent. So I just would encourage you. I know it's hard, and we actually did ours remotely last year, and I know it was challenging on our side. I can only imagine as the intern how challenging it is when you're trying to figure out who are the right people. I think this year in the summer internships, you're going to see a lot more preparedness, if you will, just because I think there's a lot of planning going into them now. We had to very quickly pivot our internship programs last year when it was like, oh my God, we're not going to be able to have them in person. We have offers out to these kids. We want to make sure they have some kind of experience. And so we didn't really have the time and the resourcing to actually think about what an internship from a virtual perspective looked like. We will have that in place now, as I'm sure will be the case in most companies. And then really it's about looking at opportunities of job fairs and participation in our industry in particular. There's a lot of, on the journalism side, there's these conferences on Black journalism, Black journalists and Hispanic journalism, and Asian journalist organizations where they do a lot of recruiting. We actually sent not only our recruiters, but we also send our news directors and our talent to these conferences to meet with people and really source talent. And we're doing the same thing across the board on just making sure we're being in the right places to recruit talent. There was actually a conference that I attended where somebody from NYU School of Marketing was in. It was really around the focus of people who studied marketing and what career paths are, and how marketers, CMOs and brands and companies that work with them can help really create a foundational program that allows, students to really look at marketing as a career, right? Because they were going to finance, they were going to economics, they were going to other areas, because it was not, the CMO role is not always necessarily the path that people think of, just because they rotate so much and people want a little bit more stability, if you will. So I just encourage you to continue to do that, because I think you're going to find a better experience now. And I do think, just based on the business is changing and the economic hard times, there are going to be less opportunities. And who cares if it's a paid internship or a full-time job? The experience will ultimately put you on the path to get you into a company that you want to be part of, if you can't get in through a regular full-time role right now.
And I would just encourage you to reach out to people you admire. It's not just, not from the perspective of how do I get my next job? That might be part of how you get your next job, but growing the circle of people who who know areas that you're interested in is a really good starting place. And something that I think you'll do throughout your career. It's something I still do. I see a report that somebody I maybe have never met before does that really touches me or inspires me. I'll reach out to them and send them a note about their work. And I just think that that's a great starting point to make a connection without any strings attached to it.
Hi, I'm Zoe Lofgren, and I'm a freshman at Scripps College, and I'm thinking about majoring in media studies and English. And I just want to know, what are the most rewarding aspects of your career in journalism? And what do you dislike most about your jobs? And also, do you have any recommendations for students who are considering working in journalism, such as opportunities for internships, particular classes that are great to take, or even books and journals to read?
Well, I would say for me, it's getting to meet and talk to and ask questions of people like Rita, people who I admire. Growing up, my mom used to do interviews, and sometimes she would do them from home. And I used to listen to her doing interviews, and I was always fascinated by the fact that she was asking all of these questions of important people. And I asked her at one point when I was a kid, Mom, are you allowed to ask that question? And she turned to me and she said, Becky, it's my job to ask that question. And as a person who's curious, infinitely curious, I love the ability to just dig really deep into different topics and different people and have those conversations. From an advice standpoint, I think writing and communication is fundamental to this work. And I happen to believe it's fundamental to all work and being qualified in all different job functions. So I would focus on any coursework that allows you to really stretch and pursue writing in depth. As an addendum to that, the reality is any newspaper, any TV station, any network, any outlet, they're going to have their own style of writing. So you'll learn that on the job, but being a strong communicator, both in person and in writing, is a really good thing. And from a opportunity standpoint, you're early in your career, in your college career, there's no reason why you can't be looking for internships right now, looking for opportunities right now, and offering to help. I think that's a big thing. How can I help? And continuing, like I said earlier, to reach out to people who you admire and offering, if there's anything I can ever do to help you, I'm happy to do it, and being really willing to do whatever it is that they're in need of.
Yeah, I would echo the writing thing. I think there's no greater skill than being able to write well. It will serve you in absolutely everything that you do, because from a, how do you deliver a hard message, right? You know, I can't tell you the amount of times I have to, you know, especially in this world of working from home, a lot of times you have to just, a lot is done in writing, and to be able to have a clear communication and be able to succinctly talk about what you need to talk about. And sometimes those messages are hard, and you have to be able to do that in a way that the person understands the message. And also just from a business proposal perspective, you know, you're writing stories on the journalism side, but on the business side, you're constantly writing proposals, financial reports, everything is in the written format, regardless of how many presentations you do. And by the way, being able to stand up in front of a room and present well is a massively tremendous asset that I think I didn't take seriously enough in my early career to spend time and energy honing. And I would say if you have the time to do that and just, you know, take improv classes, figure out how to get comfortable with on the fly, having to talk about an idea and having to really be able to communicate an idea thoughtfully and intelligently, and be able to do that in a way that doesn't make you crumble, because I have some people on my team who are amazing communicators and can write beautifully, and then they have to stand up in front of the room and deliver that, and it never lands. And it would have landed beautifully if it was only in writing. And yet the higher up you go in your career, you will have to, I mean, it's just by default. We are presenting all the time. We're in front of audiences all the time, on stages all the time. And it doesn't get any easier, by the way. Every time I go out on a stage, I have butterflies in my stomach, you know, because it's just, you know, you're presenting in front of an audience, and you want to be able to connect and be articulate and thoughtful and be able to convey the right message. And yet at the same time, most of the people in the audience have some knowledge of what you're talking about. And there's always a chance, again, that they have some piece of knowledge that you don't have. And depending on the environment, it could be really tough. And so having that comfortable, just being able to stand in front of a room and convey something thoughtfully and articulately without losing your breath and without getting so nervous that your voice starts to crack or things like that, I think is really important. And by the way, it was probably one of the hardest things for me, particularly, that took a long time and a lot of practice and a lot of, you know, repeat. You can never repeat it enough, but being able to write articulately and consistently, and then being able to stand up and deliver that message in the same way with, you know, compassion and strength and a point of view is really, really important. And by the way, when you said, what do you most hate about your job? That's one of the things I most hate about my job too. It doesn't get easy.
My name is Widel Maricruz. I'm a student at the University of Puerto Rico in Arecibo. I'm studying teleradio communications. And Rita, you've talked more about the diversity your company is working towards, but I wanted to ask both of you if you believe they are working efficiently to recruit more diverse people and have more inclusion and equity in the workplace.
I can tell you without a doubt, the answer is yes. in terms of the focus, the priority, and the investment behind that, right? Because part of this is also investing in really getting to know talent and expanding the pool of places where we source talent from and we spend time recruiting. And just in the benefits, you know, we're having conversations right now with our CEO about what are the types of benefits that we're going to need to offer new talent to come to this company that looks different than what we offer today. Where are we going to source talent, right? It's not always in the same places we've sourced the talent before. And by the way, what are the investments we need to make? You know, one of the big areas, we spend a lot of time with engineering talent. And in the engineering space, there are, you know, women hugely under indexed and people of color even more so, right? And so sometimes, even though you want to hire talent in those areas, there's just not talent to be had. And so what are the investments that we are making in talent to develop and grow the opportunities to really have a broader, diverse pool of talent? So there's no question that as the Walt Disney Company specifically, we are making investments in that space. But I would say, if you look across the industry, and Rebecca would see this more in just all the statements that are being put out across the different industries, the level of engagement around this topic and the importance of this topic across industries, whether it's the banking, you know, I saw one of the banks, I think it was JP Morgan, that said billions of dollars that they were putting into this space. You know, entertainment companies, billions of dollars in talent and people in front and behind the camera, and money in terms of how you recruit people, all of that. I think there's just a before and after that's happened this year in particular. By the way, I think because people were home and they had time to notice, right? Things may have been different if the world was moving the way it was before, but because this world has been so upside down this year in terms of everything that's going on between the presidency and people working from home and COVID and, you know, and the social reckoning that we had to deal with, and that people could actually focus on it and put time and energy and resource behind it in a way that just existed differently before. I just think that there's no way we will not have progress after everything that's happened this year. There's such a focus on it, such a priority in terms of how executives get paid, how we are going to make sure that if we are not moving the needle in certain directions, that we're just going to make change, right? And so those are things that I think, you know, as you come into the workforce, you know, being Latina, and by the way, speaking a different language also helps you in these things, right? I speak Spanish. It's a tremendous value to me in terms of how I have more opportunity in this company because I do, right? Because I can be sent to different territories, I can do different things. And that's really, really important. And by the way, as, you know, as I call it, one of your superpowers as you come in to interview for these jobs, right? Which is, how do you bring different perspective and different value to the company in a way that is really, really going to be a needle mover for us going forward?
I would only add that with people like Rita in leadership roles, it's happening because she's making sure that it's happening. And there are many other leaders within the company who I really deeply admire, who are also taking on that mantle. And the other aspect of this, and we heard a little bit about it at the beginning of this conversation, leanin.org and McKinsey have done a fair amount of research. It's not just something that we feel good about, it's also something with a significant ROI. And as more and more companies are understanding the data around this push and the fact that it's not just something that everybody can rally around, but it's something that the bottom line rallies on, it becomes imperative for businesses to continue to evolve.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I think we're done with the Q&A part. So I think we're done, right? Or do we?
Sorry, we have one last question.
Oh, great, perfect. Sorry about that.
Hi, hello. My name is Sandy. I currently attend Baruch College. I'm majoring in marketing. I would like to ask, like, how would you navigate through like a burnout? I noticed how you guys were saying you're really passionate about your job, but I would just want to learn more about how would you navigate like a burnout when you're feeling like burned out with like your job.
This is a tough one for me because, you know, I've interviewed, thank you for the question, Sandy. I've interviewed Arianna Huffington a couple of times, and, you know, her whole thing is sleep and the importance of sleep. And I 100% agree with her on that idea. But I also have debated her on the notion that if I had prioritized that and whatever, you know, you might call balance, especially earlier in my career, I honestly don't believe, frankly, that I would be in the role that I'm in. I could be wrong because we never know. But for me, I kind of put my career in front of almost everything for at least a decade or a decade plus in my life. And the world may be changing to some extent there. You have to take care of your health. And in some respects, I wish I had taken a little more care of my health. Thank God I've never had like a major health scare, but I wish that I had taken a little more care. But I also just can't, with a straight face, tell anyone who's starting out that if you fully prioritize balance, if you set big limitations on the amount of work that you're willing to do and how your schedule is going to look, that it's going to ultimately work out the way that you want it to as far as the career opportunities. At the same time, success can be defined in so many different ways. And if your idea of success, especially in the early days of your career, is that you have full balance, that you see your friends regularly, that you go out to dinner when there isn't a pandemic, that you can travel and do those things in a very balanced way, that's something you should listen to. That's what you want out of life. So consider that, but also consider the fact that there might be other people who, if they're willing to work harder and put in more time, those could be ultimately the people that a manager or a boss looks to as giving the promotions to and giving the opportunities to.
You know, it's so funny you say that, Rebecca, because I, you know, in that last panel that I did, I was for the Hispanic Scholarship Fund, this question came up, and the co-presenter with me was the CMO of Electronic Arts, and he was a guy. He was also Latin, he was Argentine, and he immediately answered the question, and he said, I, from the beginning, put a priority that at 5 o'clock I would go home, I would have dinner with my family every day. And he talked about an incredible discipline around work-life balance and how thoughtful he was about that. And I remember it came to me and I was like, I can't lie, right? Until COVID, I traveled 3 out of 4 weeks a month.
Yeah.
And I do think it is different for women. At least I still feel it's different, right? Yeah. I was thrilled. I said to him, I'm thrilled that the question came to both of us, and you're a guy and I'm a woman, because normally I'm on a panel with men and the only one that gets the question on work-life balance is me. And I'm always like, why didn't you ask them that question? But the reality is, you know, the way I responded there, I'll respond here, which is when you're starting your career, you have no family usually, no kids usually, and it's mostly about your time management and the ability to do everything that you need to do to move your career along. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's absolutely what you said. If the priority for you is you want to have as balanced a career as possible, and you can be as disciplined as he was from the beginning and say, I'm going to go home. He had kids very early. He had kids, his first child, I think he said at 24. Great. That was not my reality. And I don't think that's been the reality of most of my, as I call them, my tribe at Disney. Most of us work all the time or worked all the time, traveled a ton, sacrificed a ton. And it's not like we don't spend time with our families, because there's no question that my daughter, you know, I call it work-life integration, right? I have a great job. She gets to benefit from being part of great concerts and meeting great talent and being at places that her friends are like, oh my God, your mom has the coolest job in the world. But she also has had her mother not present at a lot of things in her life because I was traveling and I had to be somewhere else. And when you have the right boss, as you know, the day you have to be there and you have to miss something here, it's totally fine. And they never make you feel guilty about it. And they never make you feel like you made the wrong decision. But I'm not going to sit here and say it's not a sacrifice and a hard decision every day, because it is. And the best thing about COVID has been that I have spent so much time with my daughter, who's 15, and a time when it's so critical to be here. And I've gotten to have dinner with her many, many nights of the week, which would never have happened. Doesn't happen every night, by the way, anymore. It did at the beginning. Doesn't happen now because so much work, you know, we found a new normal in this where we're working all the time now too. But the notion that I agree with you, the notion of what you miss out by not being engaged more and raising your hand more, especially as a woman and especially as someone diverse in this company, I do think there is still that bias, and that you're going to have to work just that much harder to have the chance to be promoted, to have the chance for that special assignment, to have the chance for that special project, and to be in the conversation when it matters, to be able to move up. And so that is still something, it's really important for you, again, as an executive, to figure out what matters most to you, because you should never compromise on what matters most to you. But the reality is, for growth in a world where there's less and less opportunity, right? There's fewer and fewer opportunities in companies. Companies are downsizing and they're spending more in technology enablement and things like that. And there's going to be less opportunity. And so there's going to be more competition for those opportunities. And you want to be in the game, and you want to be thought of, and you want to be, and that does require some trade-offs.
I want to just say though, because I think it's really important for people to hear this. I believe, Rita, that you're incredibly happy with the choices that you've made.
For sure. No
I feel so, I am so thankful, so satisfied. I'm 39 years old. I have a daughter who's 21 months old. I have a husband who is dedicated to me, to our family, and I love my job. And so I would not go back and do any of it differently. Yes, there are trade-offs almost every day that are hard. They pull your heart and your brain in two different directions, and you make those choices. And I really feel like, as hard as those choices are, I really feel good for the most part about all of them, about the direction that I go in. And I also give myself the space that I can change. If this is wrong tomorrow, I can make a change in my life. So don't sort of, I think it's, for me, I'm very much a person of like, let's figure it out, let's do it. But I also have to remind myself that there's always room for change. There's always room to make a different decision than the one you made today or yesterday.
For sure. Absolutely. And again, goes back to the person you work for matters, right?
Yes.
Because
yes.
when I've had the right boss, I've never had to question the decision I made, and I have been because of that, I am, as a boss, very cautious of
yes,
how I speak to people and how I encourage people to take the time that's needed to spend time with their families. Because to me, I'm a better mom because I do what I do.
Yes.
Right. And that's ultimately, you know, yes, there are days I feel guilty when I miss something, but ultimately I feel great because my daughter has a great role model. She sees that women are can be as successful or more successful than men. And she sees that nothing is impossible if you really want to do it. And so I think that is really, really important in terms of having daughters also too, to have that role model, right? And my mom didn't work. My mom was a homemaker, and she raised 4 kids, which I think is infinitely harder than what I do, gotta be honest with you. And yet, so I didn't have that as a role model. And yet to me, it's like, it's an advantage that my daughter has today to see, you know what, I can do that, or I can stay at home and raise a kid, or I could be a teacher like my sister, who's a kindergarten teacher and loves what she does every single day. And they're all right. It just depends on what your choice is. And there are choices. You're absolutely right. It's all choices. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Kate, who's going to wrap us up. Kate Stanley.
Well, thank you so much, Rita and Rebecca. What an inspirational conversation and such encouraging words of wisdom. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And I also want to thank our students who had great questions today, and we apologize to any students we couldn't get to during this program.